I define restoration as this design activity because I think it's really important for us to realize that it's not just a technical or scientific endeavor, it's also a political endeavor. And just like designing spaces for people is a political action, designing spaces for non-human species is also a political endeavor.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Our guest today is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Williams College in Massachusetts, Laura Martin. In this conversation, co-host Rachel Donald unpacks what Martin defines as restoration, as well as the debate between restoration versus preservation, and why Martin argues the former is the way forward to address the biodiversity crisis. Reasons she details in her book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration. It's a jam-packed discussion full of insight, particularly on what the troubled fortress conservation model fails to address, and why Martin says human input, as well as human rights, are essential for ecological restoration.
Laura, thank you very much for joining me on this episode of Mongabay's Newscast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
This is a particular pleasure for me because obviously I interviewed you for Planet Critical, which is how I know your work. And that was fairly recently, although the episode is not out yet, listeners. And so it's great to have you on to sort of, continue the conversation as much as possible, because I know Mongabay's listeners are pretty au fait with the conservation, restoration debate anyway.
Yep, I'm very excited to talk to you today and to continue the conversation that we began on Planet Critical.
So just in case anybody's joining us that needs a kind of overview of these words and what they mean, could you give a brief outline of conservation and restoration and some of the key differences?
Sure. So I research ecological restoration. The kind of Professional Society of Ecological Restoration defines it as an attempt to heal a ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So the key things to take away from that definition are that it's an active attempt to intervene in an ecosystem and that it's specifically trying to undo human-caused harm and to try and make reparations basically for the many different ways that human societies and economies damage ecosystems and threaten biodiversity and non-human species. I came out with a book last year, Wild by Design, in which I give a slightly different definition of restoration. I define it as an attempt to co-design nature with non-human collaborators. And there I'm interested, and we can talk about this. I think that the restoration is really, as your listeners are well aware, it's a really big topic in global environmental politics right now. The UN has declared this to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. Just a few days ago, the EU voted in favor of a new nature restoration law. And it has changed a lot since it was first proposed, but the initial intent of that law was to require EU countries to restore at least 20% of their land and sea area by 2030. There's now some loopholes and some kind of fuzziness around that number, but the fact that it's on the EU's legislative slate, I think, speaks to the fact that restoration is becoming this kind of international endeavor. There's also lots of private funding and corporate funding going into restoration right now. The Bezos Earth Fund is putting a lot of money toward restoration. And I define restoration as this design activity because I think it's really important for us to realize that it's not just a technical or scientific endeavor, it's also a political endeavor. And just like designing spaces for people is a political action. Designing spaces for non-human species is also a political endeavor. So restoration is this, it differs from other types of environmental management because it is hands-on, it is actively intervening. It's doing things like breeding endangered species and re-releasing them to the environment, or trying to kill non-native invasive species. And managers do wild things to try and do that, right? Like spraying herbicide from helicopters, or employing snipers to kill non-native goats in the Galapagos Islands. There are all of these examples. Restoration can be removing dams from rivers to restore hydrological connectivity and try and restore fisheries. It can be planting plants to try and take up toxins in the soil for soil remediation. So it encompasses all of these really different, rebuilding and designing wetlands. There's all these really different activities that all fall under the umbrella of restoration. And what kind of brings them together is that they are active, as compared to wilderness preservation and what scholars have called fortress conservation. And you also hear a lot of this in global conservation right now, right? This is the idea of just setting aside big chunks of land in order to protect other species. And I'd say there's some friction or maybe even conflict between the environmentalists that believe in restoration and taking these active interventions and the ones that believe in hands-off preservation and just setting aside areas for biodiversity.
Interesting, isn't it? Because like shooting goats from a helicopter seems quite antithetical to the idea of protecting nature, and yet intervening so that we can restore, as you say, something towards a more kind of balanced ecosystem that will be able to preserve itself is sort of the intent, from what I understand, behind these policies. Mm-hmm. But what is the problem with fortress conservation? And we can talk about this through the lens of 3030, which is this idea as well, that by 2030, we will have conserved or cordoned off 30% of the Earth's landmass and oceans, I believe, in order to allow them to be great nature spaces without human intervention. But why is that not a great idea?
Yeah, I think the most blatant and obvious reason is that visions of protecting the idea that the only way to protect nature is to kick people off of land is an inherently unjust proposal, because the question needs to always be who are you talking about when you're saying we're going to set aside area for biodiversity protection. E.O. Wilson, the entomologist, kind of famous for his work on biophilia and his important work in conservation. Before he died, he published a book called Half Earth, that argued that the only way to save biodiversity is to set aside half of the Earth's area for other species and to retreat basically from half of Earth. And there was a great study done by a group of sociologists that found something, I'm forgetting the exact number, but it's something like 2 billion people would be displaced, no matter how you cut it, no matter what 50% you choose in the world. There's going to be billions of people displaced from their homes. And of course, when conservationists from the global north are talking about setting aside conservation areas, they are talking about displacing indigenous people, displacing marginalized people, displacing people that don't have robust access to governance. And it's a way, has been there, and there's many examples through history and some that I cover in my own research, that examples of conservation is coming into areas in global south and kicking people, forcibly, violently removing people from their homes in order to set up biodiversity reserves. Or I think more perniciously, letting people, and this is where we see 30 by 30, I think 30 by 30 as a concept is maybe capacious enough that I do see in some countries the real awareness of this history and desire to not repeat the injustices of the past and present. But there is a pernicious, I think, hidden way in which these proposals also, even if they're not kicking people out of their communities and homes, they might be restricting resource access for those people. And so I do think that we're seeing massive corporate investment and to some extent some government investment in the idea of expanding protected areas to 30% of the world's ice-free land area by 2030. And it's unclear how that's going to play out geographically. If you think about the United States as an example, the Biden administration has committed to this goal through executive order, through a very vaguely worded commitment to doing it. If you look at it kind of a state by state level, some states in the American West already have more than 50% of their land owned by the federal government. So that commitment is really a commitment to the status quo in those places. But then if you look at a place where I live in Vermont, most of it's in private ownership. So what does it mean to imagine that you're setting aside, 30% of the state of Vermont for biodiversity? If we're talking about strict preservation, I think that's, horrifying and problematic to imagine that we would be choosing to destroy human communities in order to do this. But if we're talking about restoration, I think that's where there's a lot more room. Restoration can be done in protected areas. It can be done in, this is a problematic term, but wilderness areas. But restoration can be done in, exurban patches. It can be done in people's backyards. It can be done in agricultural areas. It can be done literally everywhere. And in that way, I think if 30 by 30 goes toward investing in, my argument is that people who are promoting 30 by 30 should be looking at restoration and not preservation as a solution to the biodiversity crisis, which is very pressing and upon us. I mean, there's so many different threats to biodiversity right now. And I think restoration, preservation deals with the threat of habitat fragmentation and habitat degradation by setting aside area. But restoration deals with all of the other threats to biodiversity, which include climate change. One that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention is persistent organic pollutants, in just the number of, and including pollutants that are used for conservation and restoration. We were talking about shooting goats from helicopters, massive amounts of herbicides are used in restoration, in environmental management to try and get rid of non-native species. And so these compounds are all having a massive impact on biodiversity. And then you have the kind of direct, as the other kind of threat to biodiversity, you have the direct exploitation of animals through eating meat. Something like 2 trillion individual animals are killed for consumption in the world every year. And there's all of the accidental bycatch that goes along with that. And so restoration can get at all of those other threats to biodiversity.
I think what's so fascinating about this conversation and about the way that you lay it out is this use of the word protected, for example, in the preservation model, because does that mean that the rest of the land is unprotected? Does that mean, it's really interesting to look at this as a binary. And this was something that actually you sort of raised my attention to when we discussed this on Planet Critical. This idea that, first of all, human beings are not part of ecosystems, according to this model. You need to get rid of all of the humans, despite the science that shows that human beings are excellent stewards of land when sort of raised in that culture and tradition, and ecosystems suffer when you remove indigenous populations. We are biological creatures, so we do all come from the same stardust at the end of the day, And so, yes, that fact that this idea that we should all be somehow in these urban areas, and urban areas are therefore going to be these unprotected spaces. that and the pollution and the damage caused by those urban areas is going to be offset by this, 30% of the Earth's landmass that is kept in pristine condition, but not so that anybody can actually enjoy it by being integrated into it as as an organism, but just so that we can continue pollution. And we do see this already with regards to carbon credits. So, the way that carbon credits have been used with the dispossession of people, so throwing indigenous people off of their lands to take these wild spaces and put them on the market, just so that the fossil fuel industry or the airline industry or whatever other industry can continue polluting. I mean, it boggles the mind. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet it is the backbone of most policy, essentially the split between making moves to quote unquote protect the natural world just so that we can continue business as usual on the other side.
Yeah, and I agree with you that we can see a through line in those two logics of the logic that's at work in carbon offsetting and buying carbon credits, and then the logic that's at play in setting aside wilderness areas, that it splits the world into sacrifice zones, polluted areas on one hand, and then protected areas on the other hand. And when I started my career in ecology, in wetlands ecology, and I have to say I was very excited about preservation. And it's been a gradual, the position I have now has been one that's been building over my career and has been a gradual realization. But I've come to argue in my work that the idea that setting aside protected areas is the only way to save biodiversity is an incredibly defeatist, bleak, unimaginative idea. It imagines that there's no way out of rapacious, extractive capitalism, and that the only way to save the species that we care about is to create an enclave for them and to imagine that they're not part of the global economic system, which is with climate change is a fiction, right? Like everything is impacted by our economies and societies, but it's this fiction that it's simultaneously this fiction that you can set a barrier around certain ecosystems, and it is truly defeatist to imagine, the imagining that the only hope for saving other species is to set them apart from us, rather than imagining that we can revolutionize and reform our cultural practices, our economies, to actually not harm ecosystems in the first place. And I do think, as you said, there's that same logic happening with carbon offsetting. Heidi Blake in the New Yorker had an incredible piece of investigative journalism a few weeks ago about South Pole, which is the world's largest carbon offsetting firm. And it's based out of, it's a Swiss firm. And that article finds that many of the credits that they were selling to people that were, polluting and wanted to feel better about polluting were fake to begin with. They weren't actually on the ground. This was forestry-based carbon offsets. So ideally, the project would have been protecting or planting trees to sequester carbon dioxide and therefore mitigate offsets. And so these credits were, it turned out, not on the ground. There weren't actually trees that were being protected. And so there's that technical aspect, but there's also the social aspect of it, where Blake found that almost all of the money was going to one white Zimbabwean tycoon who was not sharing it with the communities that he said he was going to share it with, right? Of course. And then that just confirms other, there's a really important and I think underreported report from Oxfam from 2011 that found that more than 20,000 people in Uganda were evicted from their homes in order to create carbon offsetting plantations, and that this was a UK based company that was doing that work. And so, and there's many more stories like this. And once again, it's the idea that first off, if we only had a carbon sequestration regime in place, whether that's through trees or whether that's kind of imagining that there'll be some future technology that sucks up sequesters greenhouse gases that have already been released. Like the idea that will allow sacrifice to continue in polluted areas, not thinking about all of the, other things that go along with burning fossil fuel, like pollution and environmental racism. And then the idea that there'll also be these protected areas that, places like Zimbabwe and Uganda could become forest plantations for carbon sequestration, right? It's that same duality, as you phrased it, that same kind of cleaving off of protected and sacrifice.
It's so distressing that I feel emotionally distressed when we talk about this, because another way I think of looking at it and thinking about, well, there's so many ways, but first of all, like the kind of final nail in the coffin of like the globalization of culture, in which entire nations will be dispossessed of their peoples in order to make way for forest plantations so that, the global north can continue emitting and doing whatever they want, essentially. And it to me, it speaks of this, through this conservation model, this idea of like protected zone and sacrificial zone, this idea that like we're not doing anything to restore the well-being of the human species either. Like we are equally being sacrificed to this economic machine, whether it's, being in an urban space that has absolutely no green space and is completely polluted and congested, with very little sort of amenities that actually, facilitate even community and like well-being, all these kinds of things. That is not the focus at all. And what you said about, and we should get into it now, this idea of like restoration happening in somebody's backyard, like inviting nature back into your living space, doing something with your garden, rewilding your garden, or building, putting those like gardens on the tops of buildings or whatever, like finding a way to produce a harmony that really facilitates and also implies that we are a part of nature as much as it is a part of us, and that we don't use it, but that we depend on it to survive. That is so antithetical to our global economic thinking. It seems very difficult to imagine how we would get there, even though imagining what it would look like is actually very easy, and scholars are working on this.
Yeah, I think it's antithetical to our current economic thinking, and it's also antithetical, unfortunately, to our current academic thinking and scholarship. I mean, and this is where I think my broadest goal in my own work is to try and break down the barrier between the sciences and the humanities. Because right now we live in a world where there's ecologists and conservation biologists that study non-human species, and then there's political scientists, economists, and other scholars that study human societies. And that even just that divide in thought, it's not just an abstract, interesting problem to think about the ways in which these ideas have been severed from each other. It's an actual practical problem in the way that policies and management decisions are made right now, where if you look at the composition of the IPCC, the equivalent for biodiversity, the IPBES, and other large international scientific advising boards, there aren't that many social scientists and humanists invited to do that work. And so you get people kind of talking across each other, or people not actually working on practical solutions to the biodiversity crisis. You have people that are experts in the crisis and in biodiversity patterns at a global scale. And then you have people that are experts on economy and on imagining other forms of economy. But then we need to bring those two conversations together, because I do think that idea that nature is something outside of society, this Western idea that can permeate much of global environmentalism, is also a barrier to imagining a different future.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. The word of even the use of the word humanist, right? Which is a word that I very rarely hear.
Mhm.
And to the extent that my brain went, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, why wouldn't we be sort of like considered and studied in that kind of way? Anthropologist seems like so focused on, culture, but what is it about, our biology as well as our culture that, needs for us to be involved at that kind of level, not just this like top down hierarchical, like, the God granted intellectual species that is making decisions for everyone else. Because quite frankly, we're very bad at it. If anybody listening is a decision maker, you're not very good at it. This idea of us being included as, yeah, yeah, in the totality of what it is to be a sort of like biological creature as well as a conscious creature on this planet. Sorry, I went a bit metaphysical there, but I think you like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's necessary for us to go there in order
Mm,
to really think about how to do global conservation differently and how to address the real current crises that your listeners care about, that we care about, and that the 8.7 million species on Earth are all experiencing simultaneously.
yeah. And all valuable. Because this is the thing when you engage in this hierarchical thinking, which is implied whenever you begin to make decisions for another group of people without consulting them or another species without, taking into consideration, I don't know, even the ethics of like, do you have the right to destroy a localized ecosystem in order to make room for an airport? Like these are questions that should be answered.
Mhm.
And the answer should probably be no. Certainly with regards to like our global economy and our like development, there needs to be an understanding of like we probably have enough in a lot of places around the world and don't need to expand on that. But what can we do to bring resource access, as you said, to other people, whilst also keeping in mind, the natural ecosystem balance there? And I suppose one thing that I think is quite interesting about restoration, maybe you could speak to this, is this idea that if we are not thinking in binaries and if we're not thinking in absolutes all the time, like protected or sacrificed, then perhaps we could start to have this more nuanced conversation as well around, okay, we need some roads and a school in this part of this really rural area. How are we going to do that in a way that minimizes harm? And then how are we going to take care of the ecosystem afterwards to try and restore what was damaged in that necessary process of giving that community access to those resources?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that restoration does offer us that non-binary thinking, that kind of hybrid thinking that can be hard. Maybe it's a little unsatisfying to not have things be black or white, but restoration can really create these these environments of coexistence, environments where designers and residents are working to make the environment better for people and also to make the environment better for non-human species. And to think about the project of needing to build a road in a rural area and a school, right? There's I was just having a conversation the other day with a journalist, Ben Goldfarb, who just came out with a book on road ecology. And in that book, he covers some recent projects that where architects and engineers and designers are trying to build wildlife crossings for roads and to design roads that are less destructive I should have included in my threats to biodiversity. Roads are a massive threat to biodiversity. So many individual animals are killed on roads every year around the world, and roads realistically aren't going away. They have existed for many millennia. So how can we build roads that are more biodiversity friendly? And that's a huge open question that, because of this divide, because of this idea of purity, that nature can only be something apart from society, not that many people have researched and worked on. And so this is this kind of emerging area that Ben covers in his book. And in Wild by Design, I think about effort that from the early 19th century to present, that different constituencies have taken to try and bring back particular species or groups of species or ecosystems to areas where people are already living. And I think there's just incredible potential to do more work there. And the other way that restoration's not a kind of tidy activity or black and white is that there's really no end to it. I think, again, policymakers that are listening, part of what's appealing about preservation is that you designate a wilderness area or a nature reserve, you put a fence around it or a legal boundary around it, and then it's done. Like then the project is done. And it's a very open and closed project, where restoration is ongoing. Climate change is ongoing. The introduction of new species because of global economy is ongoing. And so this needs to be, a restoration project is not going to be done. And anyone who is a gardener or who does restoration work knows this, that you can't just finish a restoration project in a week, right? This is work that is ongoing for all time. And I think that is maybe what makes it difficult to get political funding for, and is why right now so much restoration work is done by volunteers. But I argue in my work that it's time to publicly invest in restoration work and to hire people and to actually compensate them for this work, and for governments for this to be public. I think because it is such a political decision of which places get care, which places and which species get to live and get to die, right? These are political decisions, and that they need the funding and work needs to go through governments rather than what's happening right now, which is like truly rapid privatization of restoration work.
Well, the rapid privatization of the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis and all, I mean, it's just the financialization, isn't it, as well, whilst serving governments in allowing them to offset responsibility and not open themselves up to legal action, often for their historical responsibility for causing this mess, certainly with regards to the United States, the United Kingdom, these sort of big empires.
Yeah, and I know that's a bigger theme in your reporting, right? And I think that this is where conservation and restoration fits into that broader theme of the financialization of proposed environmental solutions.
Absolutely. And I think it is interesting as well to look at it in terms of this thing of like, what are the narratives that can be constructed around preservation versus restoration? So if preservation is sort of the cordoning off of a space, and it has a time frame in that at one point it is completed, then that's a win for whatever political party is in charge. It's very clear to communicate, and it also suggests that no harm was done in the process. It suggests like we start from a neutral area, like look at the Rockies. We should protect those a little bit more, essentially, because by definition those areas already have to be fairly wild if they're going to be preserved. Whereas restoration, there is an admittance in like the real genuine caretaking that's happening in restoration. There is an admittance of the harm that has been caused.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I think there's huge political possibility and an activist possibility for restoration, is that exactly that. And this is something I explore in Wild by Design, that restoration is a tacit admitting of harm.
Mm.
It is a mode of reparation. It is a attempt to undo a societally caused or corporately caused environmental harm. And so we could do more with that, right? There's so much there. I do think that restoration is this powerful tool, could be this powerful movement of actively acknowledging harm and doing something about it. And there needs to be, with reparative justice and with restoration, I think there's parallels, right? There needs to be simultaneously the mitigation of the harm that is ongoing, right? So if we're restoring a beach because of an oil spill. There is the kind of immediate work that needs to be done of the restoration to try and undo that oil spill. But that work is going to be kind of just a Band-Aid or in vain if there's another oil spill next week.
Mhm.
So there needs to be the simultaneous, like the doing of the restoration along with identifying what harms it is that restorationists are trying to undo and trying to mitigate and stop those at the same time. These two things have to happen at the same time. And that's why I think it's so important to think of restoration not just as like breeding endangered species or planting species, but as this active attempt to repair harm and to take time as communities, as societies, to be really explicit about what those harms are.
I think this is very helpful politically for a number of reasons. First of all, for any policymaker worth their dime intellectually, this is a green jobs opportunity.
Yes.
Which is fantastic because that intersection of where labor meets green really, I think, is going to be the backbone of any effective policy going forward that gets people on board, especially a lot of people who are going to be losing their jobs due to climate change as we run out of oil or as we try to transition or rather than transition, put those extractive industries elsewhere and not on our shores, essentially. So it's really such a fantastic opportunity to meet that that call that degrowth scholars have put out, which is that we need a green job guarantee. We need, for people that want to work in helping our human society get through this climate crisis, we need to guarantee them a government job that pays well in order to bolster support for the movement. It's a no-brainer. The other reason I think that this is critical at this juncture is for activists, because there's a huge amount of action around the world. They are doing such important work in maintaining the conversation, pushing it even further, making sure these stories stay in the news, et cetera, et cetera. We know the studies have been done that the more direct action there is, the more that this conversation kind of takes place in the public consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's always been a pushback, but I think now it has like slightly more weight to it. Which is that, but what do you want instead, or what are you going to do? What are we actually going to do? And I think also we need to provide forms of direct action that don't involve people putting their bodies on the line, because that is only available to a very small section of the population, typically white, typically middle class and up. So, and people without a past criminal record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
So we really need to diversify the kind of action that we're taking place. And if we could create a kind of like restoration action movement that was only paying dividends to society, again, that could be another really interesting way to get more and more people on board, both into people who are activists in waiting and desperate to get out there but don't quite know what to do, and also people that aren't really that interested in the movement but see that it's actually helping them in their community in more than just a kind of we're saving you from something bad that's going to be 5 or 10 years down the line sort of way.
For sure. And anyone listening, please go do this. Please.
Yeah.
I definitely think that restoration is a huge green jobs opportunity, and that it needs to be framed as such because, as I mentioned, and as my scholarship shows, that restoration has been this volunteer activity and an uncompensated activity. And I think, and it's incredible, restoration is an active thing that people can do. But the way that it's been framed thus far is as kind of a, and this is a theme that we see throughout kind of climate misinformation, right? It's been framed as this individualistic activity. Like, oh, you can decide as an individual landowner, which is already excluding tons of people, right?
Mhm.
But you landowner, you can plant a pollinator garden on your private land. And that is such a narrow way of thinking about the potential of restoration, because it's restricting restoration to people who own land and people who have the time and resources to plant native species. You know, they're buying native plant species seeds is expensive, right? There's all of this, already all of these layers of narrowing when you think about restoration as something that we should be encouraging private citizens to do. But if we think about restoration as something that governments should be investing in, and that people and that governments and companies should be employing people to do, then the possibilities become much wider, and it becomes possible to build healthy environments in places everywhere. And to actually, again, anyone who's a gardener or who has done restoration work knows it's really hard work and really meaningful and important work. And so there needs to be a way there needs to be a vision of doing that at scale and enabling people to do it full time, enabling people to do it even if they don't themselves own land. And it doesn't need to be this private thing. It should be a public endeavor.
Totally. And again, it's the people who are the most vulnerable who are being left out of this possibility in the current model. Because as you say, so I remember when I went back, I went home to Scotland and to get to, because I always live away. And I was home, and I hadn't been, it was after COVID. There we go. So I hadn't been back for like a year and a half. And there's this back road that you take through the kind of, middling countryside to get to my mother's house. And there's these fields that have been farmed fields for as long as I can remember. And half of them had been rewilded while I was away, putting it in my own timeline. And they have stayed rewilded. So that's been, we're coming up for 4-ish years now. They have stayed rewilded. And I was amazed at that. And I started noticing it all around Fife, where I come from, like these rewilding projects. And it's fantastic. But as you say, it's the people who are already landowners who are receiving a government benefit for doing that. And whilst that is an excellent incentive, where does that leave the vast majority of the population? Because we know very well that our global economic system is one in which the most goes to the few. So there's only few people who are benefiting from this and getting involved in this. And so it's again this like total dispossession of like a human right to be involved in our environment and our human right to take care of one another and of the natural world around us. And to think of how this could be done differently, instead of these like private companies coming in and like cordoning off land, dispossessing Indigenous peoples, it could be that, Indigenous peoples are, share their wisdom. You could have you create training programs of okay, here are the ecosystems that look fairly similar. How can we learn from these people in order to, try and implement that better? We could flip that hierarchy, or green jobs for people coming out of university for which there are no jobs, or even leaving high school, because do you want to go to university and get into all this debt? I mean, I'm kind of going off on one here, but you get my point. In that, again, this whole problem of action being taken and available to only a few I've lost my train of thought. Not train of thought, I've lost the word. Whilst everybody else suffers due to those actions, because the actions being taken and the decisions being made are being done by a very undiverse group who cannot possibly know what is right for everyone. I think this is why, as well, I find this idea very, very exciting. Anything that just gets more people involved surely is going to be helpful.
Yeah, and it distributes responsibility differently than it is currently distributed. Again, the US example, which I'm most familiar with, is that it's really federal and state environmental agencies that right now have the resources and the mandate to do this sort of restoration work. How do we bring it to more people? How do we empower more people to be decision makers about what their biotic environment looks like? I mean, that's really the crux of my own work. And there are some promising things that have happened, at a really small scale, but we shouldn't, I shouldn't discount them. They're happening. So a few years ago, the US Department of Interior transitioned management of bison from the first the National Bison Refuge, which was one of the first examples of restoration being used to grab land from Indigenous people in the United States. And a few years ago, the Department of Interior returned management power of those bison herds to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. And that, it wasn't land back. It wasn't returning the land back. So it's a kind of limited success, but at least there was recognition there that that the tribal nation should be the entity that is in charge of doing that environmental restoration and management. And it is difficult now, I would say, for people there's such a disconnect between how we live and the environmental impacts of how we live. It's difficult for people to see that. I was just talking in my environmental history class yesterday with students about the environmental impacts of the internet. It's a great example. It's the internet we call, the cloud, right? It's this idea that there's this material thing, that doesn't have any sort of physical material impact on the world, that we can just keep all of our files and books on our computers and then not use paper. And it seems more environmentally friendly. It seems greener than some other activities, but it actually has this massive energy and infrastructure cost, the heavy metal cost, right? I think in the same way that people have been severed from understanding the environmental impact of their activities, whether it's using the internet or, what they eat, they've also been severed from the possibility, as you said, of doing environmental care, of helping to shape the physical and biotic environments around them. And that's a collective activity. There's real opportunity to expand who has that ability and who is involved in designing the shared human and non-human world.
I think what is sometimes for me so frustrating around the conversation of like harm and care is this false and very deliberate narrative that's pushed, essentially saying, oh, but look at the majority of humankind. Look how they don't take care. Look how they waste. Look how they destroy. Look at their violence. Look at how we are bad, essentially, at belonging to an ecosystem, whether that's like a biological one or societal one. And so we need to take away people's autonomy to make these bad decisions, and sequester that decision making to a small group of people that will roll out, what needs to be done. And it's like, hang on. We live in a harm-driven world. Like everything is set up to create harm and perpetuate harm. And then we blame human beings, who the vast majority are stuck within a global world order, for perpetuating harm. And it's very deliberate, and it's totally insidious. And it's totally contrary to what most social studies show about human nature, which is collaborative and empathetic and kind and generous and all of these things. And so to provide an arena, a stage essentially, to like give people that chance, which we have seen in experiments with deliberative democracy, in communities all around the world. And what people see is when you give humans the right and the autonomy to be involved, they get involved and they help one another, and political tensions decrease, and the neighborhood sort of well-being increases, and people take care of one another and also of their built-up physical environment. So again, I just love the idea of that redistributed responsibility and redistributed accountability, and redistributed then hope and optimism, because of course people are feeling dejected when it feels like nothing you do matters, because you are, as I said, trapped in a system that just perpetuates harm with seemingly no end.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that I think the most hopeful and promising thing about restoration is that it rejects the narratives that all human action is harmful and negative to the environment and to other species. And restoration is a very clear attempt. It's an imperfect attempt, but an attempt to altruistically help other species. And I think that same narrative, you see it in environmentalist circles so often, the argument, that it's overpopulation or human population growth is what the threat is to biodiversity, or that's why we have climate change, right? And it's this total lack of acknowledgement of power, and a total lack of acknowledgement of the fact that it's not It's a small subset of the global population that is choosing to consume uncontrollably. And, it's people in the United States, in Europe, that are living unsustainable lifestyles, and it's specific corporations that are incredibly benefiting from the extraction of minerals, of fossil fuels, right? Like it is not equally everybody that is responsible for the crises that we are facing. It is not humanity as one kind of blanket entity, right? And I think that the flip of that is that restoration argues that it's not just that it's not that doing harm, as you said, is not this inherent human predilection, that it's not that's not what that the world need not function this way and need not be harm centered, and that we can imagine reconfiguring economies and societies to doing this restorative work.
Absolutely. The passion in your voice is so inspiring to me, and the work that you're doing is just excellent. Thank you so much, Laura. This was absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much, even speaking to you, twice in a couple of weeks. I've learned so much the second time around as well. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Where can people read Wild by Design?
You can find Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, is available in your local bookseller or online. It's published by Harvard University Press.
All right. Laura, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was great to chat.
Again, great conversation here, Rachel. I feel like I'm going to start sounding like a bit of a broken record, but yeah, great conversation. And I don't mean to keep shamelessly plugging the Manga Bay Explorers podcast series, but something you and Laura touch upon in here is the concept of fortress conservation, which is something we did cover pretty heavily in that podcast series, in the Congo Basin context specifically. So if listeners are interested, it's worth checking that out. But I found this to be just a very engaging discussion on the debate between, preservation versus restoration. And there is tons to talk about here. There was something that I did want to mention contextually, is that roughly 80% of our planet's remaining biodiversity is on land that is either owned by or managed by indigenous populations. And that has been sort of a key point for a lot of people who are discussing 30 by 30, is that the 30 by 30 isn't ambitious enough, because technically speaking, if you were to grant land rights to all those indigenous populations, the 30 by 30 would be achieved because all those communities are already, protecting this land as is. And so I thought the fact that you and Laura brought that up, the whole, the flaws in the 30 by 30 concept, was a great entryway into this conversation.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I used this term during the episode, but 30 by 30 has been called a land grab for that very reason, essentially, that you've just given, which is that there's a really simple way to protect the natural world, and that is to just respect indigenous populations who have been stewarding it for millennia, essentially. And the fact that governments are looking to centralize that process and take such things under federal control, even though they have no experience of doing so, and even though experiments with doing so have typically failed all around the world, is deeply worrying and deeply distressing. And as Laura mentions, it just drives home this binary distinction between humankind and nature, as if we're not a part of nature. It's this, eternal Cartesian split, which is causing a lot of problems, I think, in policy, and quite frankly in our own spirituality, although that's a different rabbit hole.
Right. And it also sort of fundamentally ignores that ecosystems develop with human societies, and have developed with human societies for centuries. There's a certain aspect of the Amazon rainforest that I talked about with Fiona Maisels about seed dispersal. So she was discussing how in the Congo rainforest, elephants and apes specifically are key seed dispersers for certain types of trees. Take away the elephants, take away the apes, then those trees don't get dispersed. South America previously had megafauna, such as elephants, that would disperse these seeds, but now human beings serve as the seed dispersers for those seeds. So it's things like this that I feel like, on top of the massive amount of human rights infractions that fortress conservation has, I feel like that the fortress conservation model misses this completely, and fails to address the truth that human societies and people are also important parts of developing ecosystems. And you and Laura really touched upon that and talked about that really well.
Well, it just serves to continue this disastrous setup we have, which is these incredibly polluting, dangerous, harmful, extractive, diseased human societies alongside, pristine parts of nature that we're going to keep to offset the impact from that. And as we got on to in the episode, like, why do any of us want to live in these like desperately polluting societies? And how can we imagine a world through restoration in which human beings are embedded back into nature as much as nature is embedded back into us? Because it's causing huge, huge problems. Like when people talk about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and, the planetary boundaries and the fact that everything is on the verge of collapse, which is true and it's dangerous. Sometimes what we don't talk about is like the health crisis of human beings and the mental health crisis, and the fact that, often the best thing that people need, or what people need, is to just get back out into nature. And I don't mean this in like a tree hugger way, although the tree huggers, quite frankly, were onto something as far as I'm concerned. It is literally just a part as simple as grounding down into the world around us and seeing it as valuable rather than something to be exploited. And most people are wired that way, to see it as valuable rather than as something to be exploited.
The other thing that I feel like people miss with the idea of protected areas, or, even national parks to an extent, is that it sort of commodifies access to nature, and it turns it into a privilege. And so if you live in what is referred to many times as a sacrifice zone, you're locked out of that without having to step outside of that boundary, taking either time or money away from yourself to go and venture into nature because you live in a zone that is polluted or a sacrifice zone. Not to mention the health impacts that you're getting, but you have to travel to go and see nature. And then it therefore becomes like a privilege to get to see it. And that's another problem I see here. I don't want to get too far ahead here, but I did want to point out a couple of things that I want to elaborate on in this audio. So Laura said in the audio that we were talking about carbon credits and carbon offsetting, and she mentioned a firm called South Pole, and she described this as the largest carbon offsetting firm. And I just wanted to clarify for listeners here, you may have heard recently there was a Guardian investigation about Verra. Verra is a carbon certifier, and it's also the world's largest carbon certifier. And that was the big story where it was found that 90% of of those carbon credits were quote unquote useless. So I mean that's a separate issue that was related to South Pole. I just wanted folks to get the distinction there.
And Verra is under the umbrella of the UN as well, which I think is important to flag. Like, again, just sort of like the seemingly fundamental incapability of these institutions to make these massive at-scale decisions that are going to be effective at balancing and protecting our natural environment within the current economic system.
Yeah. Another thing that both you and Laura brought up was there's an aspect of restoration that I wanted to point out, which sometimes centers on planting tree plantations. And we've reported on this a lot at Mongabay. Well, there was a bit of research that was published in 2022 showing that even degraded or even partially logged forests were better at providing those ecosystem services than actual plantations were. And I thought that was a really big revelation when that came out. And I think that's something that sort of gets missed a lot in this conversation. Not the one that you had with Laura, but when people talk about restoration versus preservation, that even the degraded ecosystems are better than these plantations that are proposed.
Well, totally, because a degraded ecosystem, if you leave it alone, is going to be able to regenerate itself. That's what a system does. It's constantly evolving. Whereas a plantation is a typically monoculture species planted in, these rows, essentially, that allows no sort of channels for wildlife, allows no or invites no other species into it to begin with. And so in terms of biodiversity, it's dead, these plantations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I forget the exact term that it was called. It was something like an ecological dead zone. To my knowledge, the term ecological dead zone doesn't appear to be official, but it has been used to describe cases where tree plantations severely reduce biodiversity on land where native vegetation is cleared for monocultures. This is definitely not the same thing as a hypoxic dead zone in water, but nonetheless, cases where flora and fauna are harmed have been described in both media and by scientists as ecological dead zones. And so there was another aspect of this that you both talked about, and very valid points that Laura brought up in that, and you brought up, that restoration could be quickly mobilized with public participation, especially people that don't necessarily own land, and that restoration isn't something that need to be relegated to people who own land. And totally agree. But something I did want to point out is that for our listeners, if you are listening and you do own land and you do have a lawn, I just want to point out to you that, and this was something that was reported on by GRIST, 30 million tons of CO2 are released by lawn equipment each year in the United States. And I tried looking up a country comparison for that, and I found that works out to just a little bit more than the annual emissions of Denmark.
What?
Yeah.
No, seriously?
Yeah. I'll double check it just in case, but
Good grief.
Pretty sure this is actually true, according to multiple sources. And yet, Denmark's CO2 emissions used to be much higher in the 1990s, peaking around 74 million tons, and has been trending downward ever since. And also 40 million acres of land in the US are basically turf grass. Like not prairie, not gardens, just turf. And so a size equivalent to that is actually more than the US state of Georgia. So you have an entire state-sized portion of land that is just dedicated to lawns. And I just wanted to let you know that it's definitely not useless to convert your lawn into like a native habitat with indigenous flowers. That is still worth your time. So if you do own land,
do that.
It's totally okay to go ahead and convert that to native habitat.
Jump on the rewilding train. It's going to look so much better. I never got the thing with lawn. Like, what a weird, design choice. And also the fact that it people that are like, oh yeah, it's just easier to manage. Like, hello, you have to mow that thing all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember this from my childhood. I remember weekends, having to mow the lawn just incessantly. It just makes no sense to me. No sense.
I spent many miserable days in my youth mowing lawns. So yes, so it can be done, and I totally would do it if I owned a house. And I even see some people in Sydney doing it, converting their plots of grass into native habitat, which is it's a very good thing.
Totally. There's loads of resources online. This has become a kind of a trend recently. Rewilding.
Mm-hmm.
I think if somebody wants to Google, that's what to Google, rewild my garden. And loads of people from around the world have the websites where they're sort of teaching you, what is indigenous to your area, how to go about it, etc., etc. And you will really benefit from it. So, listeners, if you have grass, rewild it.
Yeah. But so that's all the things I wanted to get out of the way that I just wanted to point out. But fair game if you want to talk about anything else, chat anything about anything else.
I love speaking with Laura. I find it really, really stimulating, really intellectually stimulating. And as I'm sure listeners will have heard, essentially part of what her research is doing as well is reframing the problem, bringing another perspective, bringing a more diverse perspective. the way that 30 by 30 has run away with itself as a campaign just speaks to the levels of political inequalities that are working on the international stage as well, because there are groups that have been really shouting about this for years. Like Survival International did this whole campaign like 3-4 years ago about how it was a land grab. And the fact that these like diverse voices have not been taken into consideration when advancing the policy just goes to show that it really, the policy sphere is still being dominated by a very limited group of people with very limited knowledge about the problem, essentially, that are attacking it from one angle only, which is federalize, centralize, take control, see human beings as a problem, and try to like create an asset class of something in order to protect it. And allegedly protect it, because we look at what happens with like, you know, forests that are protected under carbon credit schemes and all this kind of stuff. And often they are not protected. Often they are logged. Often they are just used to, you know, financialize the crisis essentially and make a profit. So I think that's something in particular I really enjoy whenever I speak to Laura, is diversifying and amplifying certain perspectives on this problem, which are often left out of the conversation. Not Mongabay, obviously, but most other places.
And if any listeners are interested in other voices we've had on the podcast that talk about conservation, particularly under the stewardship of Indigenous communities, I highly recommend you check out episode 2 in the Mongabay Explorers podcast series, the Congo Basin series. Goldman Prize winner Samuel Ngifo in Cameroon, who I interviewed, gave some really good insight into this, and specifically in how that ties into reaching the 30 by 30 goals and beyond. And another voice that I would recommend checking out is that of Keely Yuyan, a National Geographic photographer, whose his work really speaks for itself, obviously. But I spoke with him about traditional ecological knowledge, and that interview, he has a lot of golden nuggets of insight that I recommend you check out. That's on the Mongabay newscast feed.
Wicked.
I contemplated whether or not adding this, but you know how sorry, I shouldn't be laughing at this because it's totally not funny. The question we were talking about last time was, do you think they know? And then I said, do you think they know we know? He said it's not. And so I think that question got answered for us this week at COP28. And I think that I can safely say that they don't think we know. That is the conclusion I've come to. Otherwise, you wouldn't say something like the climate science doesn't support that phasing out fossil fuels is necessary to reach 1.5. Completely 100% not true. I can't imagine someone would say that unless they believed that we didn't know any better. So this is like, I think that question got answered. It's becoming clearer to me. Again, this is my personal opinion. I'm sort of speculating here, but I really honestly at this point think that a lot of the delegates at COP28 don't think that we know better. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trying to pull fast ones on the public in such a very poorly worded manner. Yeah.
Totally. So I first got this feeling actually this summer when I was in Papua New Guinea on an investigative trip, and I gate crashed an event that President Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was doing. And I snuck in because there's no real such thing as security in Papua New Guinea. And I was a white woman who had done her best to like dress up like a French woman. And so they just let me in. And I asked him a question. There was like this little press conference, and it was just his press attaché essentially and like some Papua New Guinean journalists. And I asked him a question, and he went off on this like rant about how, natural gas is a transition fuel, which is not, it's a fossil fuel. And then the Papua New Guinean prime minister next to him started talking about how they were going to use their forests to like offset private industry for corporations around the world. And he considered Papua New Guinea to be like a climate neutral or carbon neutral nation. And I was looking at all of these other journalists in the room and realized that like none of them were going to ask the questions, because like not even they really knew actually what was being said and the fact that it was totally false. And so like looking at these two politicians up on stage. One, I was going to say one a world leader, one a wannabe world leader, and the other, a pretty serious politician in his part of the world, just lying through their front teeth in order to get what they want out of in order to get the message out what they want. And I was like, we are, it's a really, really dangerous time if they can lie like that so brazenly because they think that we don't know. And actually, some people don't, like the people in the room with them don't know. Then what are we, God, I mean, how do you advance with that?
Yeah, it's sowing seeds of doubt where on things that are already undeniable is sort of like a tactic I see, not this I see, but the world has seen with various certain types of movements against certain things, such as you saw it with the tobacco industry. Sometimes you see it with like people who like platform flat earthism, sowing seeds of doubt about basic fundamental things that are real, that are not contestable. When you even just introduce something, no matter how ridiculous it may sound, it sort of creates this kernel of conversation that eventually leads to denying something or clouding the situation. And so that even if there's a very loud vocal component of scientists talking about the science and being quite clear about it, that's like a tactic to sort of drown that out. And I think that the PR and marketing around climate change has sort of succeeded on that front, unfortunately.
It's about shifting the Overton window of possibility. So this, the Overton window is like this thing that essentially everything that is discussable, everything that's within the conversation is within, within this space. And we had just shifted it over the past few years to climate change is a real problem. It's real. It's happening. The science is clear, yada, yada, yada. Like that had become the kind of mainstream understanding, and it's interesting. It was that understanding in the 1990s, and then it was deliberately sort of engineered to be a bipartisan problem in the United States. And that plus the big oil campaigns really, screwed public opinion on it. But we had just moved it there. And now recently, the COP28 president saying that Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom rolling back these climate policies, which weren't very good to begin with, but rolling them back and rolling out oil and gas and like the language of the Conservative Party around climate. Essentially, all they're doing is shifting the Overton window so that they don't expect the world to suddenly go, oh no, that's right. Yeah, of course. No, there's no science. Never mind. But they expect the conversation now to like massively slow down and for debate to now happen around a thing that we'd already covered. That debate is closed. There is no debate. And so it's just a tactic for buying time to continue exploiting more fossil fuels. And I cannot fathom how either Machiavellian or nihilistic or dumb you have to be to put your energy into deploying tactics like that at this stage of the game.
Yeah. And here we are, we're at the 28th COP, and we still don't have like a viable framework for phasing out fossil fuels. Like there's just there's no plan for that. Realistic, like gonna happen. We're locked into it, gonna do it type of plan. And so that the delaying has, if that was the goal, it's worked. So
sorry, but just one last thing on that. I think it is also important to frame what he has said within the context that the past, 27 COPs have failed, essentially. Because of what you just said, because we don't have a phase out, because there's all this kind of like outrage at the moment on the internet of like, oh, it's this like oil chief and he's like going against climate science and how dare he, and that's outrageous, at least on my Twitter feed, right? It's not that outrageous, actually. Like everything has been set up for him to be able to say that. All of the past COPs have been set up to arrive at a stage where it's the 28th COP. None of them are responding to outside pressures in the way that they need to. None of them are implementing the policies within their home states, nation states in the way that they need to. And none of them thought that it was outrageous enough in the first place to allow a president of Big Oil to run this conference. Like it's just another detail that reveals the how farcical this process is.
I was just going to say, so that it was like that what you just said, no one went, that's a massive conflict of interest. Sorry, the president of ADNOC is going to be the COP president?
Yeah.
Conflict of interest.
Well, I mean,
but it was sort of like but it was sort of flipped around to be like, who better to be the president than the commodity we're trying to phase out? And I thought to myself when I heard that, I thought, that still doesn't sound like not a conflict of interest. That still sounds like it could be a problem. So
yeah. I think it's just really important to bear in mind the big picture systemic forces that are at play, because to lay it all at the feet of the UAE, or to lay it all at the feet of Al Jaber, or, you know, to lay it all at the feet of like Big Oil, like they are an ecosystem in and of themselves. And it is not at all surprising to me that this happened at this COP, and we should have been expecting it. And anybody that tries to sort of create a moral outrage about it as an individual moment is not helping the conversation. There needs to be a moral outrage about the past 28 years of climate negotiations, and this just as the cherry on top.
Yeah, well said. Well, Rachel, I've run out of things to talk about, but that's okay because we've been speaking. No, I have plenty of things I want to talk about, but we do need to wrap it up. Great job on your first episode, by the way. Really enjoyed that conversation once again, as I did this one. Yeah, great work.
Thank you. It's my second.
I'm saying this one and as well as the first.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Pleasure as always.
If you want to check out Wild by Design by Laura Martin, please see more information linked here in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series, Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach. But as always, you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month makes a big difference and helps us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And as always, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thanks, as always, for listening.